The recent decision of the Supreme Court to give sovereignty to the individual states in regards to sports betting obviously completely changes the landscape of that market across the landscape of sports. And we specifically deal with college football here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We've got Derek Helling on the line. You can join him on his Twitter feed, D Helling Sports, also Derek Helling Sports on Facebook, to get his unique insight into the matters that really truly matter to everyday life and impact people's lives and the industry of sports on a broader, bigger scale. Derek, we appreciate you stopping by again.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Definitely. So as we look at this topic, I haven't had a chance to look at this specific piece of work, but I've definitely checked out your writing on other topics. So I don't need to look at this to know that you've done your research, you have an opinion, you've certainly investigated the facts, and have a unique perspective on it. So let's start right there with your thoughts about the decision and the impact.
Well, the bottom line for me is that in a lot of ways, it's too early to tell what this is all going to look like. We've got the Supreme Court in its decision to strike down PASPA and rule it unconstitutional, really just kind of got the ball rolling on as far as what this is ultimately all going to look like for individual fans and citizens of every state of the United States. So it's going to be something that I'm going to be watching unfold just as much as anybody else.
So, Derek, in regards to your recent work, what did you focus on in regards to what aspects you tried to dissect in maybe projecting more into this decision and what it could mean?
Well, specifically as far as college football goes, there's going to be a good amount of discussion had between individual programs, between individual conferences, and other professional sports leagues. We've seen that to a certain degree with a handful of programs in Major League Baseball already, as far as being involved in the legislative conversations in the several states and even in Congress because they want to protect their interests and they see a potential to get some revenue. They're definitely going to be interested in that as well. And so in regards to college football, that's kind of what I focused on is them combining their forces, joining forces with professional sports leagues, and investigating how they could potentially play these developments to their benefit.
All right. So, taking those two aspects of it, meaning the team's attempt to gain some revenue and also their quest to protect the integrity of the game and their own reputations, let's start with a money aspect first. So, obviously, people generally above board legally betting on sports currently go to Las Vegas to do so. Las Vegas only being one entity of a municipality within one state. Therefore, the various teams across the sports leagues would not have any kind of right or claim to that money. When that money is filtered into the local economies of a particular state, I'm guessing that's the argument of those teams to be able to share in that wealth.
Yeah. The argument kind of has three pieces to it. Some of which are stronger than others. There's an argument that it's been affronted by some of the professional sports leagues that as the operators of these games, they deserve to share in the spoils. As the simple argument is, if we weren't putting on these games, none of this betting would happen. So we should get a cut. That makes sense to some degree. A second part of the argument is what you've referenced, that monitoring the betting activity and monitoring the activities of the officials and coaches and players involved takes time, takes money, and they should be reimbursed for these new expenses that they're having to incur because of that. The third part, and I think the weakest part of their argument, is that these games are their own intellectual property and they should be compensated for sharing that with sports books. I don't think that's going to hold much water as going forward. I think the first two parts of their argument are much more sound. But Las Vegas has been operating legal betting channels, as you said, for all these years. And the quote unquote illegal offshore channels have been operating quite robustly for a number of years. And the number of times where we've seen possible integrity issues rise in college football and really sports in general here in North America has been pretty minimal while all that's been going on. So this is still going to be an uphill battle for college football programs and conferences to get cut in, so to speak. But I think that it's an investment and a risk that they're going to take.
So I'm going to take a shot at the third and weakest argument for the individual leagues and teams in sharing in the spoils. So none of them invented the game that they are playing. They are, in fact, though, that the only entity that is playing, let's say the National Football League, is the only entity that has the popularity at that level in which anyone cares to watch and bet on the games. So I understand to a certain extent their claim that without us, you don't exist. This operation does not exist.
Yeah, so that is a logically sound argument. Where I think legally a lot of the problems come in is that if you follow that argument through, then anytime anybody shares a score of a game on Twitter or simply shares, if we're going into prop bets, just simply sharing that somebody has scored a touchdown could theoretically be a violation of those intellectual property rights. And so that's the kind of murky area that you get into if you follow that argument through.
Okay. All right. Is there anything in the national discussion that you see on the major platforms that is either in your mindset somewhat erroneous thinking or taking this to just some level that we don't need to be concerned about, or maybe something that's being missed that, again, a lot of it's speculation, as you said right off the top. We have to see this play out because it could be run of the mill, matter of fact, people conduct their lives as they currently do, except they have easier access and legalized access to the betting and just have been able to transfer what they currently do offshore to a legalized situation, and maybe a few added people that were a bit hesitant to do that will now freely bet, and maybe there's little implication there. Or maybe some of the worst fears come into play. I'm going to think that it's somewhere closer to the latter and not the former. But do you believe that because I'm going to a source here in you, Derek, that has thought this through and understands it from a legal standpoint and a cultural standpoint far better than most of us do, maybe some things that we're missing?
I think that I can't see a huge shift in the amount of people long term. Maybe there will be an initial spike once this is actually finally implemented and we see what that's going to look like in activity on this front. Simply because I don't see creating these legal domestic channels as something that's going to be significant enough to significantly alter people's spending habits in regards to their discretionary income and that part of their income that they're going to spend on entertainment. With that being said, I do think that college football teams, college football conferences, the NCAA itself is looking at this as a huge revenue opportunity. And of course, one depends on the other. In order for that to materialize, if it's going to be kind of a integrity fee or rights fee, whatever label you want to apply to it, that's contingent upon a lot of people either shifting their activity that they're currently doing offshore to domestic channels, or a lot of more people just jumping on a bandwagon that currently aren't on it.
All right, we got Derek Helling on the line. You can catch his work at Derek Helling Sports on Facebook, and also I believe it's D Helling Sports.
Yeah,
Correct me if I'm wrong,
you
Derek.
got, you got it.
D
Yeah.
Helling Sports on Twitter. Look at the Twitter feed. I follow Derek, and in terms of insightfulness and really investigating and digging into the matters that affect us the most when it all comes down to it. So if your team wins or loses today, I understand that people get invested in that and upset. But when it's all said and done, there are still bills to be paid. There are kids that get sick. There's a job to perform at your actual job, and those things that take care of life. And those there are areas of sports in which people are being impacted the way that you're being impacted in your life by other entities, and your team winning and losing a game is just an emotional thing. And besides that, doesn't really matter. And Derek points that out on his Twitter page, front and center, in a very humorous way.
Thank you. um, so what I think the bottom line for most college football fans and what they are going to know in this regard is I think the big thing to take away right now is it's way too early to know what this is ultimately going to look like. We could have a system which ranges from something that's very heavily regulated by Congress, and states are able to either opt in or not, to the kind of patchwork free for all that we currently see in the daily fantasy sports industry, or anything in between. Um, so that's one big takeaway right now. The second, I think, big takeaway is that programs like whoever your favorite college football team may be and the conferences that they're part of are very interested in getting involved in the legislative processes, either in Congress or in the individual state legislatures, either looking to protect their integrity interests, and at the same time, if they can get a cut of the money that's going to be produced by this coming from sports books, they aren't going to turn that down.
So, to your first point, I would think that there's going to be a more reactive approach because that's just how typically governments operate and we as individuals operate. That if there's nothing wrong, if there's nothing that's impacted us yet, then we're just going to let things roll. And so then people are going to run around and do what they can under the law or possibly stretching the law. And then when something goes wrong, there's going to be a reaction to it. And then legislation might be passed or there might be some kind of push to change things or temper things in some fashion. But until that happens, typically people in governments are reactive and aren't going to foresee what could be the model. Few people are visionary to understand what could be those things that need to be under some kind of structure. And then to the second point, this only leads me to believe that the rich and the more powerful programs are going to continue to be the rich and the powerful programs because obviously they're going to generate the most money because people are typically don't bet with their head, they bet with their heart.
Of course.
Therefore, they view the big games as the games that they need to bet on, even though there's no more of an advantage on betting on a big game than a lesser known game. Um, your sharp people in the betting industry will tell you that they're betting on all sorts of Idaho games and Wyoming, and we're thinking, why are you betting on those games? Well, because they found an edge in those games, and it's not always the Alabama and Ohio State games that have the edge, and typically aren't.
Yeah.
But those are going to be the games that people are going to bet on because
Course.
those are the games that people watch.
Yeah.
And those teams, if they take a cut, are going to make the most, and the rich and powerful in the college football game are going to be even more so in the future.
Yeah. I wrote about this. The governor of West Virginia announced that a deal had been reached between all the various stakeholders in the state and the legislature and his office for a framework for legalized sports betting in West Virginia. Various legislators in the state have refuted the existence of a deal. But two of those stakeholders who were involved in that conversation were the state's two major public universities, of course, the Mountaineers and then Marshall. And the language of this deal, according to the governor, did cut Marshall and West Virginia in on the revenue. And so news got out, and well, we'll see what ultimately plays out there because, like I said, some of the members of the state assembly have said that they're not going to support this deal and it wasn't in place. And of course, that could all be superseded if Congress steps in and says, "Oh, we're going to create a framework for this on a national level," which, by the way, is probably what all the major sport leagues, the NCAA, would prefer over the individual states doing it themselves, just because it's a lot easier to get their cut of the revenue written into a national piece of legislation rather than doing it the way of just trying to convince 50 separate individual state legislatures to do the same thing. So we'll watch how that plays out. If that does happen, that's going to create a new incentive for programs to get involved with their individual state legislatures on that front.
No, it's a good point because currently, based on the information I've seen, New Jersey's way out in front of it. Then you've got about 4 or 5 states that seem to be the next tier that have legislation drawn up, at least Connecticut, Mississippi, New York, a few others. But if we're down the road 2 years and we've got 44 states with legalized sports betting and Alabama's not one of them, I would think that the university would be putting all sorts of heat if they know that Georgia is picking up $8 million a year, just to throw out a figure, from their cut of sports betting within the state of Georgia, and they're not receiving that same revenue.
Yes, I mean that's a pretty foregone conclusion. That's what it ends up looking like. Then there's going to be a lot of pressure from the powers that be in the major conferences, especially on legislators in that regard. And I guess if you're in one of those positions, that's a great thing because you would, I'd imagine you probably have some new donors to your election campaigns come about because of that. So, yeah.
So we've got Derek Helling on the line from Derek Helling Sports. Join him on Facebook, join him on Twitter, and catch his work investigating sports and looking at the life end of it, culturally, the industry, the business, and the impact on us as individuals beyond the games. And obviously, College Football Nation watches me, and that's pretty much it. And therefore, I'm taking the college football betting angle, but at the same time, it affects all the other leagues. And of course, and then beyond that, if you're a thinker, if you want to delve into these issues, Derek, we'll let you just to explain some of your recent work and what you're working on now, in case people are interested in any of the topics that you're currently looking at.
I'm doing an interview this afternoon, actually, about how mobile technology and otherwise, is changing how fans tailgate, and things that we've got coming down the pike in that regard. Also, things that I'll be working on more directly is NC State and North Carolina just packaged their licensing rights together and sold them to IMG as one entity as opposed to as two separate. Now, North Carolina had been with IMG already, so they just extended their deal, but then they picked up NC State on top of that. And so just looking at whether or not that's going to become a trend in the future of public universities in the same state packaging their licensing and maybe even media rights together in the future, to try to, if it gets them a higher premium than they would get individually. So those are a couple of things that I'm working on right now.
I would think that the discussion would be between those two entities to determine who's the stronger of the two, and then there might be an interesting discussion between those two and within the two inner circles, because the obvious one there is that North Carolina basketball is more popular than North Carolina State basketball. The football programs are pretty much on the same plane, not in regards to on the field production.
Of course.
People hang on, but in terms of popularity and overall, rear ends in the seats, ratings on television, I would think they're very comparable in terms of football, and those are the two revenue sports. All right, Derek Helling, D Helling Sports, that's his handle on Twitter. Also, Derek Helling Sports on Facebook. If you actually want to think about the games that we watch and how they impact our lives and impact others, and some inequities out there, some issues that need to be dealt with that aren't necessarily pretty, um, in regards to human rights, civil rights, and some other things that Derek's dealt with as well. Derek, we appreciate you jumping on board.
Thank you for having me.